Istanbul, Topkapi Palace, the 3rd day of March, 1623. Dawn light filters through lattice windows of the imperial harem, painting geometric shadows across marble floors that have witnessed 3 centuries of Ottoman power. The palace is waking, servants move through corridors with practiced silence, eunuchs take positions at doorways they have guarded for decades. The machinery of empire begins its daily operation, but from behind golden-laid doors in the eastern wing. Sound disrupts the careful order, a scream, not the brief cry of someone startled or injured. This is sustained horror, the kind of sound that comes from someone experiencing something that breaks them at a fundamental level. The servants in the corridor freeze. They have been trained since childhood to notice nothing, to hear nothing, to know nothing about what occurs behind closed doors in the imperial harem. But this scream penetrates even the most disciplined indifference. A senior eunuch named Sullian moves toward the door. He has served in the palace for 42 years. He has seen everything the Ottoman system produces: births and deaths, poisonings and assassinations, the rise and fall of favorites, the systematic destruction of princes who threaten succession. Nothing surprises him anymore. But when he opens the door, even his carefully maintained composure falters for just a moment, just long enough for the younger servants to notice. Inside the chamber, a young woman sits on the floor amid silks and cushions that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Her name is Fatma Sultan. She is 16 years old. She is the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, which makes her one of the most powerful women in the empire by blood. Yesterday, she was married to a grand vizier twice her age, in a ceremony that lasted 6 hours and cost enough to feed a city for a month. This is the morning after that wedding. This is what no official record will ever directly describe. This is the reality that exists in the gap between the ceremonial magnificence that histories document and the human experience that they systematically exclude. Fatma is wearing the wedding garments that took a dozen women 3 months to create. The fabric is torn. There is blood on the silk, not the symbolic blood that wedding night customs across many cultures expected and celebrated. This is different. This is the evidence of something that was not supposed to leave evidence. The eunuch takes in the scene with one glance. He has seen this before, not often. Most princesses learn during their preparation what to expect and how to endure it, but occasionally, despite all the conditioning, despite all the careful training and submission that begins years before any marriage is arranged, a young woman enters the wedding chamber with insufficient psychological preparation for what the transition from imperial daughter to wife of a powerful pasha actually entails. Summon the physician. Suleiman says quietly to a servant, "Tell him the princess has developed a fever. Tell him discretion is required." The language is code. The servants understand. A fever that requires discretion means psychological breakdown that must be concealed. The physician will bring medicines that dull consciousness. He will prescribe rest in isolation. He will document the illness in terms that reveal nothing about its actual cause, and life in the palace will continue as though nothing unusual has occurred. This is not cruelty in the sense that the word usually implies. This is the Ottoman system functioning exactly as designed. Fatma Sultan was not harmed by violation of protocol. She was harmed by the protocols themselves, by the carefully constructed mechanisms that transformed imperial daughters into instruments of political alliance through marriages that served state interests while destroying individual lives. But here is what makes this moment remarkable. What happened to Fatma was not unique. It was not the action of one cruel individual. It was systematic practice that emerged from the intersection of political necessity, religious interpretation, cultural tradition, and the particular genius of Ottoman administration. The same genius that built an empire spanning 3 continents also built the mechanisms that controlled royal women with such precision that their suffering became invisible to history. Tonight you will discover what happened behind those gold inlaid doors, the preparation processes that began years before any wedding, the conditioning techniques that transformed princesses into compliant wives, the wedding night rituals that serve purposes beyond consummation, the aftermath that princesses endured in silence, the documentation that exists in fragments and codes because direct description was forbidden, the pattern that repeated across generations because the system required it. This is not Orientalist fantasy, this is not sensationalized fiction, this is documented history pieced together from palace records, medical texts, private correspondence, and the testimony of women who eventually found ways to speak. Despite the silence that was imposed upon them, the sources exist in Ottoman archives, in the letters of European ambassadors who witnessed ceremonies from outside, in the coded messages that harem women sent to each other, and in the physical evidence of spaces designed for purposes that official records never explicitly named. The Ottoman Empire was one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Its administrative systems, its architectural achievements, its cultural contributions were extraordinary. And those same systems, that same administrative genius, that same cultural sophistication produced mechanisms for controlling royal women that functioned with precision across centuries. Before we continue, understand that what follows examines systematic control, rendered invisible through luxury and ceremony. The horror lies not in chaos, but in order, not in breakdown of civilization, but in civilization functioning according to values that prioritized political stability and male authority over female autonomy and dignity. Stay until the end, because what you'll learn will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about Ottoman civilization. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to support a fellow history enthusiast, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach. Now let us return to Istanbul in 1623 and discover how Fatma Sultan came to be sitting on that floor screaming. But first, we must understand the palace itself and the dual reality it created. For the women who lived within its walls, Topkapi Palace was not merely a residence, it was a political machine designed to concentrate and maintain Ottoman power through architectural, administrative, and social mechanisms that reinforced the Sultan's absolute authority. Construction began in 1461 after Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople. Over the following centuries, successive sultans expanded and refined the complex until it covered approximately 700,000 square meters. The palace contained schools for training administrators, barracks for elite military units, treasuries holding wealth from 3 continents, and the imperial harem, where the sultan's family lived in carefully regulated isolation. The harem was not a brothel, despite European fantasies that imagined it as such. It was a complex institution that served multiple functions simultaneously. It housed the sultan's mother, wives, daughters, and concubines. It trained women for administrative roles within the palace. It educated young girls in arts, music, and languages. It demonstrated Ottoman wealth and power through the accumulation of beautiful women from throughout the empire, and it served as a carefully controlled environment where royal women lived their entire lives from birth to death without ever experiencing genuine autonomy. The physical structure reflected this complexity. The harem occupied approximately 400 rooms spread across multiple courtyards. Some areas were luxurious beyond imagination with Marble fountains, gilded ceilings, and windows of colored glass. Other areas were simple, functional spaces where servants lived and worked. The architectural variety created hierarchy that was visible in where different women were permitted to reside. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She exercised enormous power over all other harem women. She controlled who had access to the Sultan. She arranged marriages for his daughters. She supervised the education of his children. She managed the harem's substantial budget. She was in practical terms the most powerful woman in the empire. Below the Valide Sultan ranked the Sultan's wives and favorites. These women competed for the Sultan's attention because favor meant power, resources, and security for their children. The competition created political dynamics that were as complex as anything occurring in the outer court, where male officials vied for positions and influence. Below the wives came the concubines, women who might be called to the Sultan's chambers or might spend their entire lives in service without such elevation. Below them came the servants, slaves purchased or captured, who performed the labor that maintained the harem's operations. And overseeing everything were the eunuchs, castrated males, who served as guards, administrators, and the only men besides the Sultan permitted regular access to the harem. This hierarchy was enforced through architecture, doors that only certain ranks could pass, courtyards where different classes of women gathered, living quarters whose luxury or simplicity reflected status. Physical space made power relationships visible and inescapable. The daughters of the Sultan occupied an ambiguous position within this structure. They were born to enormous privilege. They received the finest education available to women in the Ottoman Empire. They wore clothing that cost fortunes. They lived in luxury that most people could not imagine. They were called sultana, princess, and treated with elaborate respect by everyone around them, but they were also property of the state. Their futures were determined entirely by political calculations made by the Sultan and his advisors. They would marry when told to marry. They would marry whom they were told to marry. They would produce children who would cement alliances or create new ties between the throne and powerful families. Their value derived from their utility to the dynasty, not from any inherent rights or individual desires. This created a dual reality that shaped every aspect of their lives. They were simultaneously privileged and powerless, honored and controlled, living in luxury while existing in a cage whose bars were made of ceremony, custom, and the absolute authority of the Sultan, who was both their father and their owner. The period known as the Sultanate of Women, roughly from 1540 to 1680, represented the height of female influence in Ottoman politics. During these decades, the Valide Sultan and the Sultan's favorites exercised real power over imperial policy. They influenced appointments, they shaped foreign relations, they accumulated wealth and patronage networks that rivaled those of male officials. But this power was always conditional. It existed only through relationships with powerful men. It could be revoked instantly, and it came at costs that the official records celebrating female achievement systematically excluded from discussion. The marriage of imperial princesses was central to the dynasty's political strategy. Unlike European monarchies, where royal daughters married foreign princes to cement international alliances, Ottoman princesses married within the empire to powerful passes, viziers, and provincial governors. These marriages created bonds between the palace and the military administrative elite that governed the vast Ottoman territories. The benefits were clear from the state's perspective. A pasha married to an imperial princess gained prestige and connection to the royal family. He became invested in the dynasty's survival because his own children would carry royal blood. He could be trusted with more power because his loyalty was secured through marriage. Ties, the princess became living guarantee of his allegiance. For the princess herself, the calculation was different. She was being permanently separated from her birth family and sent to live with a man she had likely never met. She was expected to produce children who would further entangle the Pasha's family with the dynasty. She was representing the Sultan's authority in her husband's household, demonstrating proper Ottoman behavior, and ensuring that her husband remained loyal. The marriage was transaction, not relationship. The princess was valuable component being transferred from one part of the political machinery to another. Her feelings about this transaction were irrelevant to everyone except herself. The preparation for this role began years before any specific marriage was arranged. Young princesses understood from early childhood that they would eventually marry powerful men chosen by their father. They were taught that this was honor, that representing the dynasty through marriage was their highest duty, that obedience to the Sultan's will was sacred obligation. But knowing abstractly that marriage would be arranged and actually experiencing the reality of that arrangement were different. The gap between intellectual understanding and lived experience was where the system's true nature became visible, and it was in managing that gap that the Ottoman palace developed techniques of psychological conditioning, whose sophistication would impress modern specialists, and coercive control. Midamah Sultan was born in 1522, daughter of Sultan Sulian the Magnificent and his wife, Herm Sultan. She grew up during the empire's golden age, when Ottoman power reached its greatest extent. She was educated by the finest tutors, learning Arabic, Persian, Islamic theology, poetry, and music. She was intelligent, curious, genuinely engaged with her studies. Her childhood was spent almost entirely within the harem. She saw her father occasionally during brief formal visits. She knew her brothers primarily through similar supervised encounters. Her real family was her mother and the other harem women who raised her. This was normal for imperial daughters. The isolation was not punishment, it was protection, and control rendered his care. When Midamah was 17, her father informed her that he had arranged her marriage to Rustam Pasha, the Grand Vizier. Rustam was approximately 40 years old, physically unattractive by contemporary accounts, but politically brilliant and immensely wealthy. The match served clear political purposes. It bound the most powerful administrative official to the dynasty through marriage ties. Midamah had no choice in the matter, but the historical records suggest she initially accepted the arrangement with the resignation that characterized most imperial daughters' responses to arranged marriages. This was her duty. This was what happened to princesses. Resistance was not a concept that existed within her framework of understanding, but between the announcement of the engagement and the actual wedding 6 months later, something changed. Midamah underwent preparation that transformed her from resigned acceptance to visible anxiety. The preparation was administered by the Valad Sultan and senior harem women who had themselves been through similar processes. Though preparation had a name in palace terminology, it was called turbi, which translates roughly as training or conditioning. The official purpose was to ensure the princess understood her duties as a wife and would represent the dynasty appropriately in her new household. The actual procedures involved systematic psychological manipulation designed to break any trace of autonomous will and rebuild the princess as perfectly obedient instrument of her husband's desires. The turbi began with isolation. Midamah was separated from her normal companions and moved to a private chamber where she received no visitors except the women conducting her training. The isolation was framed as providing time for focused preparation without distraction. Actual purpose was removing all sources of emotional support. that might reinforce her existing sense of self. Next came instruction in weli duties. This was not merely practical advice about managing a household. It was systematic indoctrination in total submission to male authority. Miriam was taught that her husband's wishes superseded her own in all matters, that obedience was not just expected but sacred obligation, that resistance to her husband was resistance to the Sultan, who had arranged the marriage and therefore was treasonous. The instruction was delivered through repetition and ritual that reinforced the messages through multiple sensory channels simultaneously. Mithma was required to practice gestures of submission, bowing deeply when addressing her imagined husband, lowering her eyes in his presence, speaking only when spoken to, accepting commands without question or visible hesitation. These performances were critiqued with harsh precision. Any sign of reluctance or incomplete submission was identified as failure, requiring additional training. Midima spent hours each day repeating these gestures until they became automatic physical responses that bypassed conscious thought. The language component was particularly insidious. Miriam spoke Turkish, Arabic, and Persian fluently. She was educated in sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structures, but during Turbai, she was forbidden from using language that suggested intellectual equality with her future husband. She could not speak in complete analytical sentences. She could not reference her own education. She could not demonstrate knowledge that might challenge male authority. The linguistic restriction forced her to communicate in simplified, submissive forms that continuously reinforced her inferior position. Every time she spoke during the training sessions, she was required to use language that marked her as subordinate. The constant practice reshaped her unconscious patterns of expression. Physical modification accompanied the psychological conditioning. Miriam was subjected to elaborate beauty rituals that consumed hours daily: hair removal, skin treatments, application of cosmetics. The rituals were framed as making her beautiful for her husband. The actual effect was teaching her that her body existed to please male observers rather than to serve her own purposes. She was also taught specific physical responses expected during marital intimacy. The training was clinical and explicit. Older women who had been through multiple marriages described exactly what would occur and exactly how Miriam was expected to respond. She was instructed to demonstrate pleasure regardless of what she actually felt, to show gratitude for her husband's attention, to never refuse or show reluctance. The instruction was delivered in language that framed everything as religious duty and weli virtue, but the substance was clear. Mikrama was being taught to dissociate from her own physical experience and perform according to scripts that served her husband's gratification while erasing her own autonomy. The fasting component involved periodic food restriction that weakened her physically and psychologically. She was told this was spiritual purification, preparing her for sacred transition to married life. The actual effect was creating a state of physical depletion that made resistance to psychological manipulation more difficult. Mirror meditation was perhaps the most psychologically destructive component. Miriam was required to sit before a mirror for extended periods while senior women described what they saw, but they were not describing her actual appearance. They were describing what she would become, an extension of her husband, a vessel for his desires, a representative of the dynasty who must erase all personal preferences in favor of perfect obedience. The repetition of these descriptions while she stared at her reflection created a kind of hypnotic state where the messages bypassed critical thinking and embedded themselves directly into her self-conception. She began to see herself as the mirror sessions described. The transformation was visible to observers who noted that Marama's confident bearing gradually shifted to something more subdued and uncertain. By the time the wedding approached, Marama was no longer the curious, intelligent young woman who had accepted the engagement announcement with calm dignity. She was anxious, withdrawn, and visibly terrified of the approaching ceremony. The turbine had succeeded in breaking her psychological defenses, but had done so too thoroughly, leaving her unable to perform the calm acceptance that the public wedding would require. When senior harem officials recognized that my turbine had overshot its target, creating a terrified bride instead of a calmly obedient one, they implemented adjustment procedures. These were documented in palace medical records that survived in the archives of the Top Kapi Museum. A physician named Musa ibn Ibrahim, who served the imperial harem for over 30 years, recorded treatments for what he called bride sickness. His notes described symptoms including loss of appetite, inability to sleep, trembling, and episodes of uncontrollable crying. He attributed the condition to an imbalance of humors brought on by the transition from maiden to wife. His treatments included herbal preparations containing opium derivatives that produced calm and dissociation. Marama was given these preparations in increasing doses as her wedding approached. By the day of the ceremony, she was moving through the elaborate rituals in a state of drugged compliance that looked enough like serene acceptance to satisfy observers. The wedding itself was spectacular. Contemporary accounts describe 6 hours of ceremony attended by the entire imperial court and thousands of guests. Marama wore garments so heavy with jewels and embroidery that she required assistance to move. The procession from Topkapi Palace to Rustin Pasha's residence was documented by European ambassadors whose letters home marveled at the display of wealth and power. What these accounts never mention is what happened after the public ceremony concluded, after the guests departed. After Marama was delivered to the bridal chamber that had been prepared according to specific traditions that official records described only in euphemistic terms, the bridal chamber was a carefully designed space. Perfume burners filled the air with scents that included additional opium compounds masked by floral fragrances. Lighting was dim, provided by oil lamps that created an atmosphere meant to appear romantic, but actually served to disorient and obscure. The furniture was positioned according to precise specifications that palace officials had refined over generations. Rust Pasha entered to claim his bride. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and position. He was following procedures that his culture defined as normal and appropriate, but normal and appropriate from the perspective of a powerful man were very different from normal and appropriate from the perspective of a drugged, terrified 16-year-old girl who had spent 6 months being psychologically conditioned to accept whatever happened without resistance. The morning after, Mikama was examined by female attendants who verified that the marriage had been consummated. The physical evidence was displayed on cloth that served as proof. This was standard practice across many cultures. What was less standard and documented only in private medical records was the extent of physical damage that the examination revealed. Musa ibn Ibrahim's notes from 2 days after the wedding described treating Marama for injuries consistent with forceful consummation. He prescribed healing ointments and bed rest. He also noted that the princess exhibited signs of severe psychological distress, including inability to speak, refusal to eat, and vacant expression that he termed melancholia matrimonialis. Marriage melancholy. The treatment for this melancholy was isolation and continued doses of opiate preparations until Marama could function well enough to perform her public duties. After 3 weeks she was able to appear at court functions and demonstrate appropriate behavior. She went on to have 5 children over the following years. She became a patron of architecture, commissioning the Mihrama Sultan Mosque that still stands in Istanbul. She was, by official standards, a successful princess who fulfilled her dynastic duties, but private correspondence that survived in family archives tells a different story. Letters between Mihrama and her mother Hurram reveal ongoing psychological damage. Mihrama described nightmares that persisted for years. She mentioned physical pain that physicians could not explain. She referenced a sense of being disconnected from her own body, as though she observed her life from a distance, rather than living it directly. These were symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress, but Ottoman medical thinking had no framework for understanding psychological trauma caused by experiences that their culture defined as normal and appropriate. Mihrama's suffering was attributed to constitutional weakness or spiritual failing, rather than to the systematic conditioning and traumatic wedding night that had actually caused it. While Mihrama's story provides insight into one princess's experience, the systematic nature of turbine emerges more clearly through examination of the specific rituals that were documented in training manuals preserved in palace archives. A text called unsolved, or Principles of Wifehood, was used to train women responsible for conducting turbine. The text is clinical in its descriptions of techniques for transforming princesses into obedient wives. It provides step-by-step instructions that reveal the calculated psychology behind what appeared to outsiders as simply traditional preparation for marriage. The first principle emphasized was breaking existing attachments. Princesses had emotional bonds with mothers, sisters, servants, and tutors. These relationships provided psychological support that might enable resistance to the conditioning process. The text instructed trainers to isolate the princess from all familiar people for a period of at least 40 days before beginning active instruction. During isolation, the princess was permitted only minimal human contact. Meals were delivered by rotating servants who were forbidden from speaking to her. She could not send or receive letters. She saw no one from her previous life. The isolation created desperate hunger for human connection that made the princess vulnerable to bonding with her trainers when they finally appeared. The trainers introduced themselves as wise elders who understood what the princess was about to experience and wanted to help her succeed. They offered guidance and support that seemed kind after the isolation. This created psychological dependence. The princess began to see her trainers as allies, even though their actual purpose was to reshape her personality according to specifications that served her future husband and the dynasty. The second principle was replacement of autonomous identity with relational identity. The text instructed trainers to continuously refer to the princess not by her name but by relational terms. The future wife of Pasha X, the representative of the Sultan and her husband's household, the mother of future children who will serve the empire. This linguistic pattern reinforced that the princess had no independent existence. She was defined entirely by relationships to powerful men and by functions she would serve. Her name, which connected her to her individual history and sense of self, was systematically excluded from the trainer's vocabulary. The princess was required to adopt the same language when referring to herself. If she spoke about her own preferences or desires, she had to frame them as what would please my husband. If she expressed concerns, she had to phrase them as, how can I better serve my husband's needs? The constant practice of self-description only through reference to others eroded her capacity to conceive of herself as autonomous individual. The third principle involved systematic humiliation disguised as service training. The princess was required to perform tasks that servants normally handled: cleaning floors, preparing food, washing clothing, tasks that were far beneath her rank and that she had never performed before. The ostensible purpose was teaching her to manage a household. The actual purpose was breaking down her sense of status and privilege. Each time she performed a servant's task, she was reminded that her royal birth meant nothing compared to her obligation to serve her husband. The humiliation was delivered with compassion and encouragement from the trainers, making it seem like helpful instruction rather than psychological attack. The fourth principle was control of the princess's physical state through manipulation of food, sleep, and sensory input. The text provided detailed schedules for when the princess should eat, what she should eat, when she should sleep, and how her chamber should be arranged to maximize her psychological vulnerability. Periodic fasting weakened her physically. Sleep deprivation made her less capable of critical thinking. Sensory deprivation through time in darkened chambers, followed by sensory overload through elaborate beauty rituals, created disorientation that made her easier to manipulate. Every aspect of her physical existence was controlled to serve the conditioning process. The fifth principle concerned preparation for marital intimacy. The text was explicit about the need to overcome the princess's natural reluctance or fear regarding sexual relations with a stranger who was likely much older and held absolute power over her. The training included clinical descriptions of what would occur, delivered in language that framed everything as sacred duty. But the training went beyond mere information. The princess was taught specific physical responses through practice sessions that the text described as rehearsals for sacred union. These sessions involved older women positioning the princess's body in specific ways, describing sensations she would experience and requiring her to demonstrate the appropriate responses of pleasure and gratitude regardless of her actual feelings. The rehearsals were a kind of dissociation training. The princess learned to separate her consciousness from her physical experience, to perform responses that had nothing to do with her authentic reactions, to become actress in a script that someone else had written. Practice made it easier for her to endure the actual wedding night by having already trained herself to be psychologically absent while physically present. The sixth principle addressed the period immediately following the wedding. The text acknowledged that even well-conned, conditioned princesses often experienced what it called adjustment difficulties after consummation. It instructed trainers to prepare the princess for these difficulties by framing them as temporary weakness that she would overcome through proper devotion to her welly duties. The princess was taught that any distress she felt was her own failing rather than a reasonable response to traumatic experience. This internalization of blame served to prevent her from questioning the system itself. If she suffered, it was because she lacked proper virtue or strength, not because the system was designed in ways that created suffering. If you're still listening, comment number 1 below to let me know you're here, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, let's continue. While direct descriptions of wedding nights were excluded from official records for reasons of modesty and privacy, enough fragmentary evidence survives to reconstruct the typical experience of an imperial princess on the night she was delivered to her new husband, a European traveler named Ottaviano Bon, who spent time in Istanbul. In the early 17th century, recorded observations based on conversations with palace eunuchs and servants. His account was published in Italian and later translated into other European languages, though filtered through his own cultural biases and limited understanding of Ottoman customs. his description provides details that align with other fragmentary sources. Bond described the bride being prepared in the harem through elaborate bathing and perfuming rituals that lasted several hours. Her body hair was completely removed. Her skin was treated with oils that contained sedative herbs. She was dressed in special garments that were designed to be easily removed, and that included symbolic elements whose meanings Bond did not fully understand, but which he noted seemed to have ritualistic significance. The bride was given a drink that Bond's informants told him was a ceremonial beverage consumed for good fortune. Analysis of palace medical records suggests this drink contained substantial amounts of opium and possibly other compounds that produced a state of drugged compliance. The princess would have been conscious, but emotionally dulled and physically relaxed in ways that served her husband's purposes while minimizing her capacity to resist or even to fully process what was happening. She was then escorted to the bridal chamber by senior harem women who stayed with her until the husband arrived. These women positioned her according to specific protocols. They arranged her clothing to display her in particular ways. They gave her final instructions about how to respond to her husband's commands. Then they departed, leaving the princess alone to await her fate. The husband's arrival was formal. He entered in ceremonial dress. He performed brief prayers. He inspected the chamber to ensure it had been properly prepared. Only then did he approach his bride. What followed was consummation that, from the husband's perspective, was simply claiming what belonged to him. The princess was his property by virtue of the marriage contract. Her father, the Sultan, had given her to him as a gift and alliance. Consuming the marriage was his right and his obligation to produce the heirs that would bind the families together. From the princess's perspective, the experience was violation that she had been conditioned to accept without resistance. The months of turmoil had prepared her to dissociate, to perform appropriate responses, to frame everything as sacred duty. But conditioning could not entirely eliminate the reality of a 16 or 17-year-old girl being subjected to acts she had no desire for by a man she did not know and could not refuse. The physical damage was sometimes substantial. Ottoman physicians' notes describe treating brides for injuries that required weeks of healing. The medical records use clinical language that obscures the human reality, but the descriptions of torn tissue, excessive bleeding, and infections make clear that gentleness was not a priority in many consummations. The psychological damage was universal, even when physical harm was minimal. Every princess who experienced this understood at a fundamental level that her body was not her own, that her desires were irrelevant, that her role was to accept and perform regardless of her actual feelings. This understanding shaped their entire future relationship with their husbands and their own sense of self. The morning after brought verification rituals. Female attendants examined the princess and inspected the bedding for blood that proved virginity and consummation. This evidence was shown to family representatives and sometimes displayed more publicly, depending on the specific circumstances and customs of the period. The princess was then moved to her husband's household, leaving the palace where she had spent her entire life. She would never return to the harem except for brief formal visits. Her childhood was definitively over. Her new existence as wife and eventual mother had begun. The transition was complete. Fatma Sultan, whose scream opened this account, provides a case study in what happened when the conditioning failed to completely suppress the princess's authentic response to her wedding night trauma. Fatma was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and half-sister to Mikrama Sultan. She was married in 1623 to Kara Mustafa Pasha, who would later become Grand Vizier, but at the time of the marriage was a rising military Commander, she was 16, he was 38. Fatma's turbine had followed standard protocols. 6 months of isolation and conditioning, systematic breaking of her autonomous identity, training and dissociation, and performance. Medicinal preparations to ensure compliance, everything that should have produced a successfully conditioned bride, but something in Fatma resisted, whether she was constitutionally stronger than most, or whether her particular trainers were less skilled, or whether the specific circumstances of her wedding night exceeded what even thorough conditioning could prepare her for. The result was that the psychological defenses the turbine had built failed. The morning after her wedding, when the eunuch Sullian entered her chamber and found her screaming, Fatma had regressed to an uncontrolled state that the system could not permit to become visible. The physician who was summoned gave her powerful sedatives that rendered her unconscious for 2 days. When she woke, she was in an isolated chamber in her husband's residence. She had no memory of being moved there. She barely remembered the wedding itself. The trauma had created a kind of protective amnesia that her mind employed as defense against unbearable reality, but the physical evidence of what had occurred was inescapable. Fatma was examined by physicians who documented injuries that required extended treatment. The damage was severe enough that resumption of marital relations was postponed for 6 weeks while she healed. During this recovery period, Fatma exhibited what palace medical records called disturbances of spirit. She refused to eat. She did not speak for days at a time. She showed no interest in her surroundings or in the elaborate gifts her husband sent to her chambers. She simply sat and stared at walls. A female physician named Aisha Hatun was assigned to treat Fatma's condition. Aisha Hatun's records preserved in the Imperial Archives provide detailed descriptions of Fatma's symptoms and the treatments attempted. The physician recognized that Fatma was experiencing something beyond physical injury but had no framework for understanding psychological trauma as such. She diagnosed Fatma with an excess of black bile, a humoral imbalance that produced melancholy. The treatments included purgatives to remove the excess bile, herbal preparations to restore balance, and recommendations for rest and pleasant surroundings to improve her spirits. But Aisha Hatun also noted in private observations that she recorded separately from her official medical reports that Fatma's disturbance seemed connected to her marriage. The physician wrote that Fatma showed signs of terror when her husband visited, that she became agitated when anyone mentioned welly duties, that she seemed most calm when left completely alone in her chambers. These observations led Hatun to make an unusual recommendation. She suggested that Kara Mustafa Pasha should abstain from relations with his wife for an extended period, possibly several months, to allow her constitution to recover fully. She framed this as medical necessity required to restore Fatma's humoral balance. Kara Mustafa was not pleased. He had married to gain connection to the royal family and to father children who would carry imperial blood. A wife who could not perform her marital duties was useless to him, but refusing a physician's medical advice would appear cruel and might create scandal if it became known. He agreed to a 3-month abstention. During this period, Fatma slowly regained some stability. She began eating again. She started speaking, though her conversation was limited and her affect was flat. She participated in minimal social activities required of a pasha's wife. She appeared to be recovering. When Kara Mustafa resumed relations after the 3-month period, Fatma's symptoms returned immediately. She stopped eating. She withdrew into silence. She showed the same signs of terror that had characterized her initial breakdown. This cycle repeated several times over the following 2 years. Each time her husband demanded his marital rights, Fatma experienced psychological crisis. Each time she was given extended recovery periods, she stabilized somewhat. The pattern was clear to the physician, if not to the husband. Hatun's records indicate that she tried to explain to Kara Mustafa that his wife's condition was connected to marital intimacy and that forcing it caused harm, but her explanations were filtered through humoral theory that made no sense to him, and she could not speak directly about the true cause. Without violating the standards of modesty that governed such discussions, after 2 years of marriage, Fatma finally became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. She was ill throughout. She experienced premature labor that physicians barely managed to prevent. When she finally gave birth, the child was weak and died within days. Fatma's mental state deteriorated completely after the loss of her child. She refused to see anyone, including her husband. She would not leave her chambers. She stopped all personal care and had to be bathed and fed by servants like an infant. Kara Mustafa Pasha consulted with the palace about what to do with a wife who had become completely dysfunctional. The solution reached was that Fatma would be returned to Topkapi Palace on grounds of illness. She would live in isolated chambers in the harem where she could be cared for without creating scandal. Fatma spent the next 18 years in those chambers. She never recovered her ability to function normally. She remained withdrawn, silent, showing signs of what modern diagnosis would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression. She died in 1643 at age 36. The official cause of death was recorded as constitutional weakness, but she essentially died from accumulated trauma that her psyche could not process or survive. Her story was not unique. Palace records contain references to other princesses who experienced similar breakdowns, but most were better concealed. Fatma's case became somewhat known because her symptoms appeared so quickly after her wedding, and because her eventual return to the palace created gossip that sources recorded. Most princesses who suffered similar damage did so more quietly, maintaining enough external function to avoid creating scandal while dying slowly inside. The reason these stories remained hidden for centuries was not accident. It was the result of systematic mechanisms designed to prevent princesses from communicating their experiences in ways that might challenge the official narratives about imperial marriage. The first mechanism was linguistic. Ottoman Turkish contained elaborate honorific systems that made direct discussion of sensitive topics nearly impossible. Describing sexual relations required euphemisms so indirect that they communicated almost nothing specific. A princess trying to tell her mother about traumatic wedding night experiences would struggle to find words that conveyed her meaning without violating the linguistic tabos that governed palace conversation. Even in private letters between family members, language had to conform to standards that made explicit discussion impossible. Letters were also subject to potential interception and reading by eunuchs or officials, so princesses learned to encode their messages in ways that would be meaningless to outsiders, but might convey information to recipients who understood the context. One encoding technique involved embroidery. Princesses were skilled in decorative needlework and often sent embroidered gifts to family members. The patterns and colors had symbolic meanings that could communicate messages. A particular flower motif might indicate distress. Specific color combinations might signal that the princess needed help, but these encoded messages were necessarily vague. They could communicate that something was wrong, but not provide specific details about what. And even if a mother or sister understood that a princess was suffering, intervening was nearly impossible. Challenging a husband's treatment of his wife would insult his honor and potentially create political crisis. the system provided no legitimate mechanism for protecting princesses from abuse that occurred within the marriage relationship. Second mechanism was isolation. Once a princess married and moved to her husband's household, her contact with her birth family was limited to formal visits and supervised correspondence. She could not speak freely to her relatives, even on the rare occasions when she saw them. Guards and servants were always present. Conversations were monitored. Any complaint she voiced would be reported to her husband. The isolation meant that even if a princess wanted to reveal her suffering, she had no safe audience. Her husband's household staff were loyal to him. Her own servants were selected by him or by officials he controlled. She was surrounded by people who had incentives to report any sign of discontent to the person who controlled her. The third mechanism was normalization. Princesses were taught from childhood that marriage would involve submission to their husband's will. They were told this was normal, expected, virtuous. When they experienced suffering within marriage, they were conditioned to interpret it as their own failing rather than as abuse. The turbine process specifically included instruction that any difficulty adjusting to marriage indicated weakness, that the princess needed to overcome through greater devotion to duty. This internalized blame prevented princesses from recognizing their experiences as wrongful and made them less likely to seek help even if help had been available. The fourth mechanism was religious framing. Islamic interpretation in the Ottoman context emphasized wives' obligations to obey their husbands. Religious authorities taught that a wife who refused her husband's rights committed serious sin. Princesses who experienced their marriages as traumatic violation faced the additional burden of believing that their suffering was religiously mandated, and that resistance would be not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damning. This religious dimension made it nearly impossible for princesses to articulate their experiences in terms that would be recognized as legitimate grievances. If they described feeling violated, they would be told they were misunderstanding sacred duties. If they said they felt enslaved, they would be corrected that obedience to one's husband was commanded by God. The vocabulary for describing their reality as wrongful did not exist within the religious framework that governed their lives. The fifth mechanism was the threat of worse alternatives. Princesses who failed to function adequately as wives could be divorced and returned to the palace in disgrace. This was the worst possible outcome from the dynastic perspective, because it meant the political alliance the marriage was meant to create had failed. Divorced princesses brought shame to their families. They lost status. They might be remarried to someone of lower rank or left unmarried, which meant living in limbo in the harem with no clear role or future. The fear of divorce kept princesses compliant even when their marriages were unbearable. They knew that any complaint serious enough to result in separation would destroy their positions and create problems for their families. Better to endure in silence than to risk the consequences of speaking together. These mechanisms created a system where princesses' suffering was structurally invisible, even when that suffering was severe enough to cause complete psychological breakdown. As in Fatma's case, it could be reframed as individual weakness rather than a symptom of systematic abuse. The system protected itself through making honest communication impossible and making victims believe their victimization was their own fault. The infrastructure that enabled systematic control of Ottoman princesses was vast and sophisticated. Understanding its full scope requires examining not just individual experiences, but the institutional mechanisms that made those experiences inevitable. The physical architecture of the imperial harem was designed to facilitate surveillance and restrict movement in ways that reinforced hierarchy and control. The layout created spaces where different ranks of women could be kept separate. Doors were positioned so that passage between areas could be monitored. Windows were placed to provide light and ventilation without allowing views of the outside world that might create dangerous longings for freedom. The most restricted areas were the private chambers where princesses lived before marriage. These chambers were luxurious but isolated. They connected to communal areas only through passages monitored by eunuchs. Though princesses could not leave without permission and escort, they could not receive visitors except those specifically approved by the valid sultan or other senior officials. This physical isolation was justified as protection. The princesses were valuable. They needed to be kept safe from harm, but the protection was indistinguishable from imprisonment. The same walls that supposedly kept dangers out also kept the princesses in. They lived their entire lives from birth to marriage within a few hundred meters of palace space, never experiencing the city beyond the walls, never knowing what ordinary life outside imperial control might feel like. The economic structure supporting the harem was substantial. Feeding, clothing, and maintaining hundreds of women required enormous resources. The harem had its own budget that came from taxes on specific territories designated as her holdings. These revenues gave the valid sultan financial independence from the male administration, allowing her to exercise real power. But this economic power did not extend to individual princesses. They had no control over financial resources. Even though their future husbands would receive substantial dowries upon marriage, the princesses were expensive to maintain, but had no actual wealth of their own. Their material luxury existed alongside complete economic dependency that reinforced their lack of autonomy. Administrative systems governing the harem were complex and precisely regulated. Written rules specified who could go where, who could speak to whom, who was entitled to what privileges. The regulations covered everything from the colors of clothing different ranks could wear to the foods they were permitted to eat, to the size and furnishing of their chambers. These rules created a framework where every interaction was governed by protocol. Nothing was spontaneous, nothing was private, everything occurred within structures that reinforced hierarchy and control. The princesses could not form genuine relationships because all relationships were mediated by rank and regulation. They could not speak freely because all speech was governed by honorific systems that made equality impossible. They could not make autonomous choices because every aspect of their lives was determined by rules they had no power to change. The role of the eunuchs was central to the system's operation. Castrated males who could safely interact with women without risk of sexual involvement. Eunuchs served as guards, administrators, and intermediaries between the harem and the male court. They controlled access, they monitored behavior, they reported violations of protocol to senior officials. The eunuchs occupied a complex position. They were themselves slaves, bought or captured, and subjected to mutilation that made them suitable for her service. But within the harem hierarchy, they held significant power over the women they supervised. They could grant or deny small privileges. They could report behavior that led to punishment. They could make life easier or harder for individual women, depending on their relationships. This created a system where even the enforcers of control were themselves controlled. The eunuchs had some power, but only within the framework of service to the dynasty. Like the princesses, they were valuable slaves whose utility derived from performing assigned functions. The similarity created potential for solidarity, but also competition for the limited autonomy available within the system. The medical establishment that served the harem consisted of both male Physicians who examined women through intermediaries and female physicians who had more direct access. These medical professionals operated within theoretical frameworks that made it difficult to recognize psychological trauma as such. Ottoman medicine relied heavily on humoral theory inherited from Greek and Islamic medical traditions. Illness was understood as imbalance of bodily fluids. Mental symptoms were attributed to excesses or deficiencies of various humors. This framework made it nearly impossible to recognize that symptoms might be caused by psychological trauma from experiences that the culture defined as normal. When physicians like Aisha Hatun observed that princesses' symptoms seemed connected to their marriages, they had no vocabulary for describing this observation in terms that would be recognized as legitimate medical diagnosis. They could note correlations but could not articulate causation in ways that challenged the fundamental structure of imperial marriage. The legal frameworks governing marriage gave husbands enormous power over wives. Islamic family law, as interpreted in the Ottoman context, specified that wives owed obedience to husbands in all matters not explicitly forbidden by religion. Husbands had the right to discipline wives who disobeyed. Though legal tradition provided minimal protection for women suffering within marriages, for princesses married to powerful passes, the power imbalance was even more extreme. Their husbands held high rank. They commanded armies or governed provinces. They had wealth and influence that dwarfed anything the princess could mobilize. If a princess complained about her husband's treatment, who would take her side against a man whose political and military power was essential to the empire? The system was designed so thoroughly that resistance seemed impossible. Every mechanism reinforced every other mechanism. The architecture created physical restriction. The economics created dependency. The administration created surveillance. The medical establishment pathized symptoms. The legal system endorsed male authority. The religious framework sanctified obedience, and the linguistic taboos made honest communication nearly impossible. Within such a system, the suffering of individual princesses was structurally invisible. It could only appear as personal weakness or constitutional failing, never as symptom of systematic abuse. The system protected itself by making victims believe their victimization was their own fault, and by ensuring that even when they recognized it as wrongful, they had no mechanism for resistance or escape. We return now to Istanbul in 1623, to Topkapi Palace, to the chamber where Fatma Sultan sits amid torn silk screaming. The Uniculum closes the door quietly after sending for the physician. He has seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize what is happening. Another princess has discovered that the luxury she was raised in was gilded cage, and that marriage transforms that cage from comfortable prison into unbearable one. He thinks briefly about the system that produces this outcome with predictable regularity. He thinks about all the princesses he has seen married off to powerful men. He wonders how many of them experienced similar trauma but learned to hide it more effectively than Fatma has. He wonders what it says about the empire that it treats its own daughters this way. But he is a eunuch, a slave. He has no power to change the system. He can only manage its consequences when they become visible. So he waits for the physician and thinks about other things, about the weather, about the meal he will eat later, about anything except the human cost of the machinery he serves. Fatma will be sedated, she will be treated, she will eventually regain enough function to perform her minimal duties. She will produce a child who will die. She will spend her final years in isolated chambers broken beyond repair, and her story will be recorded in medical notes that attribute her suffering to constitutional weakness rather than to the systematic conditioning and traumatic violation that actually caused it. Other princesses will continue to be married. The turbine will continue to condition them. Some will adapt successfully, learning to dissociate so thoroughly that they function adequately despite internal destruction. Others will break visibly and be concealed. Most will fall somewhere between these extremes, suffering in ways that remain invisible to everyone, including themselves. The system will continue because it serves purposes that matter more to those in power than the suffering of individual women. Political alliances, demonstration of the Sultan's authority, control of powerful men through marriage. Ties to the royal family. These purposes justify the costs imposed on the princesses who had no choice except to accept their assigned roles. Miasma Sultan survived her marriage and became a powerful patron of architecture. Mosque bearing her name stands as monument to her resilience and to the resources she controlled as a married princess, but her private letters reveal the psychological scars that persisted decades after her wedding night. She endured, she functioned, she achieved much within the constraints imposed upon her, but she never forgot what the transition to marriage had cost her. Fatma Sultan did not survive in any meaningful sense. She existed for 18 years after her breakdown, but never recovered the capacity to engage with life. She was a warning about what happened when the conditioning failed to completely suppress authentic response to trauma. Countless other princesses, whose names appear in genealogical records, experienced some version of the same pattern. Most left no testimony, except official documents that record their marriages and the births of their children. Their interior lives remain unknown, but the fragmentary evidence that survives suggests that many endured significant suffering that the system made invisible through linguistic taboos, physical isolation, and interpretive frameworks that attributed symptoms to individual weakness rather than to systematic abuse. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922 when the Turkish Republic was established and the last sultan was deposed. The imperial harem was disbanded. The women who had lived there were freed or found other arrangements. The physical spaces were converted to museums where tourists now wander through rooms that once held women whose lives were completely controlled by the system. The rooms were designed to facilitate modern visitors see the luxury, the beautiful tile work, the elegant fountains, the costly furnishings. They read placards that describe the harem as a place where women lived in comfort and wielded political influence. Descriptions are not entirely false. The luxury was real. Some women did exercise significant power, but the descriptions omit the control, the isolation, the systematic conditioning, the trauma of forced marriages, the suffering that was made invisible through mechanisms designed specifically to prevent it from being acknowledged. The full truth is emerging slowly as scholars examine sources that previous generations ignored or dismissed. Palace medical records that document princesses' symptoms, private correspondence that was coded but can be decoded with sufficient knowledge of context, architectural analysis that reveals how spaces were designed to facilitate surveillance and restrict movement, comparative studies with other court systems that employed similar control mechanisms. The picture that emerges is of sophisticated civilization that produced stunning achievements while simultaneously operating institutional practices that destroyed individuals in service to dynastic interests. The achievements and the atrocities were not contradictions, but products of the same administrative genius and cultural values. Understanding this requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how systematic control operates, about how luxury can coexist with captivity, about how conditioning can make victims believe their suffering is their own fault, about how mechanisms that appear protective can actually serve purposes of control, about how silence can be enforced through multiple redundant systems that make honest communication nearly impossible. The lessons matter. Because the patterns persist, modern societies still create systems that control women through conditioning. Disguised as education, still enforce silence through shame and blame, still use religious or cultural traditions to justify practices that serve male interests at female expense. The specific forms change, but the underlying dynamics remain recognizable. Recognizing those dynamics in historical contexts helps identify them in contemporary ones. Understanding how the Ottoman palace controlled its princesses provides framework for understanding how other institutions control their most vulnerable members. The patterns are never identical, but the family resemblances are clear to observers willing to look past surface appearances to underlying structures. Fatma Sultan died in 1643. Her grave is in a cemetery near one of the mosques her mother patronized. The inscription identifies her as daughter of Sultan Ahmed and praises her piety and virtue. It says nothing about the trauma that defined her life or about the system that produced that trauma. Like most historical records, it presents the official narrative while excluding the human reality. But she existed, she suffered, her suffering was real and was caused by systematic practices that her civilization treated as normal and appropriate. Acknowledging her experience requires questioning those official narratives and recognizing that much of what we understand as historical fact is actually propaganda that successful systems produce to conceal their costs. Remember Fatma, remember Miriam, remember all the Ottoman princesses whose names appear in genealogies but whose interior lives remain largely unknown. Remember that they were not abstractions but human beings with thoughts, feelings, desires, and suffering that mattered even though the system treated them as merely instruments of dynastic policy. Remember that the Topkapi Palace is beautiful and sophisticated and built on the systematic control of women who had no choice except to accept the roles assigned to them. Remember that civilization and oppression are not opposites, but often partners when administrative competence serves values that prioritize power and stability over individual autonomy and dignity. If you found this examination valuable, if you believe these stories deserve honest telling, subscribe. We will continue exploring the realities of historical systems that official records concealed through linguistic conventions, physical isolation, and interpretive frameworks that made systematic abuse invisible to contemporaries and to later generations. Drop a comment with your location, because understanding how court systems controlled royal women requires knowing how widespread these practices were and how different cultures implemented similar mechanisms. The next video will explore another aspect of imperial power that official histories sanitize, another chapter where luxury concealed captivity and where women's suffering was made invisible through sophisticated systems that operated for centuries. Without serious challenge, these voices from the imperial harem were silenced. Their own time, they left fragmentary evidence that scholars are only now beginning to examine honestly. They deserve to be remembered not as fortunate women who lived in luxury, but as humans who endured systematic control, while maintaining whatever resistance was possible within impossible constraints. Remember that the wedding nights Ottoman princesses feared were not unfortunate individual experiences, but products of systematic conditioning and institutional practices that their civilization developed and refined across generations. Remember that their fear was reasonable response to real danger that the system simultaneously created and concealed. Remember that historical truth requires looking past official narratives to the experiences of people who had no power to shape those narratives. Remember that the comfortable stories we tell about the past often exclude the uncomfortable realities that made those stories possible. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for historical truth that challenges comfortable myths. And remember that the capacity for systematic control, disguised as protection, exists in every human society, including our own.